organization that is at the heart of promoting liberty ideas and free markets in Africa. Now, the mission of Face of Liberty International is to expand Africa continent growth by working with network of independent partners organizations that promote free markets, individual freedom, and they are also devoted to pinpointing and expunging any blockage to human success. All right, so once again, I want to welcome every one of us. You're all welcome to this call. All right, so permit me to start now with the welcome address, and the welcome address is going to be given by Leon Oguwende. Okay, so who is Leon Oguwende? Leon Oguwende is a transdisciplinary manager. He holds a bachelor degree in statistics. He's a certified business, project, and product manager. He sits on the board of 2 multinational companies. Leon has a cumulative of over 2 decades of volunteering experience in major aspects of human development. He's a Toastmaster, and ultimately is the founding president and the CEO of Face of Liberty International. Welcome with me, Leon Oguwende. Over to you, Leon.
Thank you very much, Damlola. I don't know, I'm kind of overwhelmed seeing a number of people joining this call right now from every corner of the globe, even though to some people it's deep in the night. Thank you very much. So to start with, I was saddled with the responsibility of saying the welcoming address. I think Damlola mentioned some things about what I was supposed to talk about, but that being said, I'm still going to walk around it. So welcome to the maiden edition of the Free Market Conference organized by Face of Liberty International. The Face of Liberty International is a free market focused think tank in sub-Saharan Africa with the mission to expand African continent growth by working with a network of independent partner organizations that promote free markets and individual freedom. And those organizations need to be devoted to pinpointing and expunging any blockage to human success. We believe these will lead us to our vision to be the preacher of the idea of liberty to every corner of Africa, and also to put the song of freedom on the lips of every African someday. Since the official launching of the organization in December 2020, we have been able to reach out to over 1,000 individuals in person and virtually like this with our events and our programs. I want to share my screen for us to see a bit of visual of what we've been up to over the last 18 months in December 2020 that Face of Liberty was activated or was founded, so to speak. Give me a moment. Let me share my screen. Okay. Coming. Okay, so now this is basically the highlight of what we're doing. A free market focused think tank from Africa, we expand African continent's growth. We work with a network of independent partner organizations that promote free market, individual freedom, and are devoted to pinpointing and expunging any blockage to human success. And these are some of the visuals from our first official event back then in 2020 December. The ladies up here and the guy are volunteers for the event. These are the first official event we did in December, tagged Ibadan Free Market Summit. And this pictures that you're seeing right now and the event itself pushed our partners and our donors and other organizations who believe in the idea of what we're trying to build in Africa to say, you know what, we're going to support you in these, and can you take it to a bigger audience? So these are all the people that stayed till the end of the event on that day. So moving on, that puts us to the free market project tour, where we now have to do the summit that we did in December 2020 in a larger form, going to 25 states in Nigeria and reach as many as possible individuals on the ideas of liberty, the principle of free market and economic freedom. This is the one-year project for us here, right here in Face of Liberty International. And currently we've been able to reach 3 states. We had to pause because of the conference, which we supposed to be an in-person conference before, but due to the immigration policy of the Nigerian Home Office in the United States, most of our teachers are currently on call right now. We're not able to secure their visa down to Nigeria, which makes us come on online version of it. So now let's see some pictures from the ones that we've done so far. This is from Lagos Free Market Summit, where we have our speakers and our audience asking questions. And this is the set of people that were available at the end of the summit that day. So moving on, we have for Kogi State, and also we have for other locations around as well. So why are we here today? We are here because the free market needs to be known. And me personally, I'm believing other scholars on this call will believe and will agree with me that once the free market problem is solved, 50% or 60% of the libertarian problems are already solved. So we try as much as possible to go out there and teach people what it means for economic freedom, what economic freedom means, what the free market principle means, and how can you live your life in accordance with the free market principle, which is why we're here. And now we believe reaching out to a bigger audience will go a long way. And thanks to our teachers all around the globe that accepted to be part of the speaker for this conference. I don't want to talk too much because I can call myself a semi-expert on this when I have my scholars, hopefully like Mr. Dan Mitchell, Professor Ken Schooland, and a host of others on this call right now. So, Damilola, over to you. Let's get the show going. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, thank you very much, Leon. That's a great one from you. Indeed, Face of Liberty International has made a lot of impact, and we are so, excited to know that so much record and works have been recorded so far. Well done, and a good one to the organization. So moving forward, I'll be calling up on our first speaker for this great conference today, and you all will welcome with me, Ken Schooland. Okay, so before I bring him up, I would like to introduce Ken Schooland to every one of us. All right, who is Ken Schooland? Hi, thank you for being here. It's a privilege to have you on this call. Okay, guys, so permit me to introduce Ken Schooland to every one of us. Ken Schooland is an associate professor of economics and director of the Entrepreneur Center at Hawaii Pacific University. He's the vice president for international relations for Liberty International, on the board of scholars for the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, and a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. Schooland authored The Adventures of Jonathan Gullible, A Free Market Odyssey. He also published in 80 plus editions in 50 plus languages and adapted to theatrical and musical productions across Africa, Europe, and Asia. He also authored Shogun's Ghosts, The Dark Side of Japanese Education. Schooland was the director of the graduate program in Japanese Business Studies at Chaminade University of Honolulu, and he's also a professor of economics at Akkodate University in Japan. He served as an international economics in the U.S. International Trade Commission, the U.S. Department of Commerce, and the U.S. Office of the Special Representative for Trade Negotiation. You can imagine what a great man we have here in our midst today. So you all should welcome with me, Ken Scotland. He's going to be speaking to us on the topic, economic freedom and prosperity. You're welcome, Ken. Thank you. You have the floor now. I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
Okay, let me have this, Damilola. And everyone on the call, I want you to really appreciate Dr. Ken Scotland, because right now it's 3:17 a.m. in Hawaii, where he's speaking from. So it's a huge sacrifice. Thank you very much, Prof. This thing, right.
Thank you very much. So glad to see you, Leon, and thank you very much for your great, kind introduction. Yes, it is early in the morning here, but for a very, very worthy cause, I'm very delighted. Hello, Dan Mitchell, too. So glad to see so many other very friendly faces, familiar faces on this program as well. I'm wearing the shirt that I wore, that I was given when I first went to Nigeria with Thompson Ayodele many years ago for the first publication of The Adventures of Jonathan Gullible in Nigeria, and for a lecture tour in Nigeria and in Ghana. I'm going to start to share my screen here for my my presentation. And let's see, I think, okay, you'll see the slides here. And okay, let me tell you just a little bit about myself too, in that not only do I teach at Hawaii Pacific University, and I welcome many of you to come. I've been working with my wife over many years, many decades actually, to promote free market ideas at seminars and camps for Liberty International, for Language of Liberty Institute, and my wife's many years of conferences, over 10 years in China, and many countries, along with many other scholars, including Dan Mitchell, and I see him in the audience here tonight, wearing coat and tie too. I'm glad to see that. I don't think I've ever seen that before, Dan. And we have another conference coming up in Tbilisi, Georgia, this coming summer. I would hope that many of you could join us too at the Liberty International World Conference. What I've done, found most effective and most enjoyable for myself, is my book that is in 85 publications in 57 different languages, 4 plays and audiobooks, and the philosophy of liberty animation that you were shown just prior to my introduction. But the book has been made available in a number of languages for Africa. I see John Nyangulu in the audience here now, and I'm so pleased to meet him. I would hope to meet him face to face sometime. He produced the Chichewa translation just this last year. It's also been produced in Kiswahili, Arabic, French, Somali, and an English language edition from South Africa, and the play that was produced by Adedayo Thomas and others in Nigeria. So this has a good history in Nigeria. Now, the question today has to do with prosperity. People around the world have always been fascinated with the ideas. And as a matter of fact, I think I should attribute having borrowed this slide from Dan Mitchell one time. It shows that for many, many centuries, the amount of wealth per person was about the same. It did not change at all until just very recently, when there was a tremendous improvement in the amount of wealth per person. And this gives a lot of people encouragement and hope that life is changing, not from the static condition of life before. And let's see here, how can I move this on? Okay. One of the big and dramatic changes that came in human thinking came with an idea that was maturing at the time of Adam Smith in 1776, when he published his book on the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, when there was a tremendous shift in thinking about wealth. It isn't just the accumulation of gold, it was the enjoyment of consumer goods and services, consumption that opened up the world to free trade from an era that preceded it of just pure mercantilism. Along with that came a tremendous improvement in life expectancy, in which people were improving their lives. Just in the recent years, with this tremendous increase in wealth, it made it possible to have the food, clothing, and shelter and medical treatment that allowed people to live long lives. Instead of living an average age of 30 years of age, people are now able to live 70 and 80 years of age. So the number of people growing in and participating in the wealth creation around the world was tremendously on the rise as well. Sure, a lot of people were being born and able to survive with better nutrition and health and medicine and shelter, but also did it spread around. The number of people living in extreme poverty was down, and the percentage of the population was in great decline all around the world. So there were lots and lots of changes. Poverty was down, education is up, democracy is on the rise, as people become more aware and educated, and health conditions are certainly much, much better. But of course, we've seen tremendous hit to this in recent years. As the countries have gone into lockdown, many countries have taken a step back. I think it was in the World Bank that gave this report below, where it said that global poverty rates are forecast on the rise. 500 million people may be pushed into destitution, largely because of the pandemic. Well, that's not the pandemic so much as it is the lockdown that accompanied the pandemic. But that seems to be changing now, opening up. And another great benefit of this prosperity is that people have fewer children and smaller families, because with prosperity, people decide to have a greater focus on the education and well-being of their children rather than just on the numbers of children. And this is true around the world, that the number of births per woman are rapidly in decline, and nearing the replacement rate or exceeding the replacement rate, meaning that the replacement rate is the number of births that have to exist just to offset the number of deaths. And that's roughly 2.1%, 2.1 births per woman. And that is happening around the world, that we are now getting to the point where there are fewer and fewer children being born and populations are in decline. The fertility rates, the number of births per woman across the industrial world, the OECD nations, is all below the replacement rate, except in a few countries. The United States probably right at the replacement rate because of the increase in population or offsetting population from immigration. But that means that people are able to focus on tremendously improving their living conditions rather than just hoping to survive. But the question today isn't what is happening to the world wealth, but what makes it possible to proceed, to progress. So often in history, people have been asking the question, why is there poverty? But that should not be the real question. The real question should be, why is there prosperity? Because poverty is the real natural state of condition of human beings. And prosperity is the unnatural state, is where people are making life different than what it was in the past. And we can see that there was a vast difference in the prosperity of North and South Korea. It wasn't that one kind of culture and one kind of ethnic group was able to succeed where others could not. No, you take the same kind of culture and population, the people of North and South Korea of the same ethnic background, and yet of that same culture under two different systems comes great, great prosperity, as has occurred in South Korea, or great poverty as continues in North Korea. Again, this is a chart that I've borrowed from Dan Mitchell. Thank you very much, Dan. So my explanation for how this comes about is from the Economic Freedom of the World Index that was compiled by the Fraser Institute in Canada. And they looked at the conditions for different countries to succeed and become prosperous. They look at the size of government spending and taxation, how much of the wealth of an individual is taken from him by the state so that he's not able to enjoy the benefits of his own productivity and be incentivized by the growth of his own hard work and efforts. If the government takes a very large portion of it, that of course reduces the amount that he has left over for investment in his future and in his prosperity. How secure are property rights and contracts in a country? If you have no security or certainty in the property that you've gained, can the government just take it away from you? Then that is a disincentive to further growth and prosperity. But if you're able to benefit by the work you put into different things, you can your business or your home, then you have a greater certainty of improving that in the future. How secure are the contracts and agreements that you have with friends, or is it all vulnerable to corruption and power rather than to solid mutual agreements? How sound is the money that people use in their transactions? Is it disappearing overnight because of the falling value of your currency, or is it keeping solid and in its value so that people can count on the value of savings and investments over time? How open is the country to trade and exchange, not only with the people in your neighborhood where there are improvements in specialization and division of labor, but how far can you take that trade, not only with the people in your neighborhood, but people around the planet? And how much regulatory restraint is there in the government controlling you and your every move, or are you free to make your decisions and innovations through life? So this Economic Freedom of the World Index ranks different countries of the world by these 5 criteria. Up in the blue is the area with the most economic freedom, and green lower, yellow lower still, and red the least amount of wealth per person. I mean, no, not the wealth per person. This is the amount of degrees of economic freedom that you're allowed in the production of wealth. Well, when you look at some countries of the world, you say that you can see that there's a very big difference between, let's say, the Venezuela, the amount of wealth per person in Venezuela, and the amount of wealth per person in Colombia. And so people move from countries of low economic freedom to countries of high economic freedom, as we've seen recently. Even though Colombia isn't very high on the ranking yet, it is considerably higher than those people in Venezuela. The people in the blue zone, with high degrees of economic freedom, have the greatest amount of income per capita. They have the greatest amount of growth over time. Their life expectancy is longer. They have much greater political and civil liberties. Gender inequality, the difference between the treatment of men and women is much, much better in the countries that are prosperous. And the income of the poorest 10% is much greater in the countries that are ranking high on this zone. This can also be said of the degrees of corruption. There's a high measure of corruption in countries with the greatest controls on people's lives, because the people in power have a great deal of favors to sell to their friends and punishments to sell to their enemies when the government has very, very strong controls over society. And I would say that one side benefit too is that there's a better environmental performance, a better lifestyle in terms of the air pollution and better treatment of the land and of the people when there is greater prosperity to handle those problems. Well, how does Nigeria rank? Nigeria over the last 9 years, well, from 2010 to 2019, that's the report in the most recent Economic Freedom of the World Index that came out in 2021. It shows that Nigeria has made tremendous improvement just in the past 9 years. They've gone up on this chart in many ways with regard to these 5 conditions of economic prosperity. That's a very good sign. And I'm hoping that perhaps you will have a better explanation for that, even than I, because you're living very close to it. What about some other countries? Tanzania, for example, was and still remains a little bit lower on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, but it too has improved a lot in the last, in recent years. Uganda, on the other hand, has moved from a high rank, a much higher rank in 2010 down to a lower rank in 2019, somewhat of a decline in their ranking on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which doesn't bode well for their conditions. Now, when we talk about property rights as one of those conditions, it's a very tragic situation when people have their property just taken from them by the state in what is known as eminent domain. That's Latin for superior owner. It happens a lot in the United States. It happens in other countries around the world, especially in China, where the government decides that people are going to take people's land. And when people get in the way, they are literally crushed. In India, I'm more familiar with the way that eminent domain has been abused around the country of India. And during the British colonial times, the government of Great Britain just took lots of land from the tribal villagers and made it into national parks because of the desires of the colonial rulers. And when the British left India, they turned these national parks over to the government of India that maintained them as national parks, much to the disadvantage of the populations in those areas that depended on their farming and abilities. Now, a lot of these people were in desperate condition and living on the edge of starvation, forced into road work for the national parks. Every time they tried to build farms and houses, those were torn down and just confiscated. And so these were just terrible conditions that people were living in. Fortunately, for a group that I've been working with, the Liberty Institute and the Right to Property movement in India, people have found a way with a passage of a law that allowed for secure property rights if they could prove that they had worked the land. And so with the use of Google Maps and these handheld GPS devices, the farmers could go around the land that they were working, mark out their land, and then establish sound and secure title in their land, which made it possible for them to have secure property rights to the land that they were working. And it transformed their lives. They were able to build houses. They were able to fence off their crops. They were able to implement modern sophisticated methods of solar irrigation and dams and canals. And these advancements all led to tremendous increase in wealth and respect in the community that allowed them to save up a great amount of wealth for their future, for them to make, they were able to get cell phones so they could make connections with the marketplace and get the best prices for their products. They were able to then tremendously develop the education for their children into a higher school, higher education, and professions that brought back a tremendous measure of prosperity to these people. Now, what is the importance of sound money? Sound money means that your amount of the purchasing power of the money that you have remains stable over time, that you can count on the amount of money you've put into savings and investments. And when you have unsound money, that means a declining purchasing power of your money, then you cannot count on those things. You cannot count on the money for your savings, for your pensions, and you cannot count on the money that you put aside for investments. And it can destroy the incentives for productive activity. And we find, in my view, that there's been a tremendous redistributive effect as from inflation, when the government prints up lots and lots of money, as they did some years ago in Zimbabwe, when they printed out the $100 trillion marks. It can devastate the economy because it has a tremendous effect of taking the wealth from the losers in society, the people on fixed incomes, the people with savings. They depend on that money in order to purchase the goods and services they need to live. And it loses value as prices go up, as so much money is printed. And then people who have loaned their money to others through savings and pensions or as creditors directly, and it goes tremendously to the winners in society, people who have been deeply in debt, they can pay off in cheaper money. People who hold land and real estate and gold and foreign currencies and museum collectibles, and the people who get to print the money and spend it first before the prices go up are all the main beneficiaries. While the governments of the world are the biggest winners in every category. They're the biggest owners of debt, the biggest owners of real estate, the biggest owners of gold, the biggest owners of foreign currencies and museum collectibles, and they get to print the money and spend it first before the prices go up. And it rewards all the people close to them, and as they are the ones who receive the new money. And of course, the people who pay for it all, hidden and confiscated in the loss of purchasing power, are all the vast peoples of society, especially the poor in society, who lose when their income and savings loses purchasing power. And also through what we call tax bracket creep. When people have to earn more money just to buy the same goods and services, it puts them into higher tax brackets, and the government takes a larger percentage of their income. So in these ways, inflation is devastating for people who are productive in society. Now, with regard to trade, the openness of a trade is very evident. The Economic Freedom of the World Index proves that people who have the countries that have the highest degree of openness to trade also have the highest amount of wealth per person. They have the highest growth rates. And this can be true for both rich countries and poor countries. It doesn't matter whether they're rich or poor. If they're open to trade, they will grow much more rapidly than if they are closed to trade, because it is a tremendous way of improving the total factor productivity of the people of your country to be able to specialize with comparative advantage. Now, there are different schools of thought that address these issues. But I categorize them basically in these broad categorizations: the communist school, the Keynesian school, the monetarist school, and the Austrian school. Now, the first three that I've mentioned there, the communist school, the Keynesian school, and the monetarist school, all believe in controlling and manipulating people in various ways in society, as if the rulers know what is best and how to shape people's lives. They do it by owning all the resources of society, or by spending rapidly and diligently through government action, fiscal policy, or by monetary policy and controlling people through the money supply and interest rates and such. But the Austrian school that I favor allows the greatest amount of economic freedom. For most Austrian economists, government is minimized and limited simply to a protective role, and it allows people the greatest amount of freedom in the pursuit of their own economic life, and they don't trust government to rule people's lives. A great example of this was the Asian tigers. The Asian tigers were probably much poorer than countries of Latin America in the, say, 1950. You could say that these countries of Latin America had the amount of wealth per person that was considerably higher than most of the countries of these Asian tigers of South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. But in 50 years, with very, very great resources, the countries of Latin America did improve the lives of their people to some degree by increasing the amount of wealth per person, maybe 3 times or 4 times. But nothing compared to the tremendous increase of the amount of wealth per person in the Asian tigers, where they had 25 or 35 or 40 times more wealth per person because of economic freedom. Now, it wasn't that the Chinese had it in them, this industrious capacity to improve their lives, because the Chinese in China didn't make those changes. It's the Chinese that left China, went to Hong Kong and Singapore and all kinds of overseas places did they have a tremendous increase in the amount of wealth per person. So much so that the people of Hong Kong have a greater amount of wealth per person than that of the United States. And Singapore, greater amount of wealth per person than all the countries of Europe. And then we had all because of their position. The people of Hong Kong were certainly improving their life, becoming the wealthiest in the world, whereas the people of Cuba back in 1950, as wealthy and prosperous as the people of Hong Kong, have had almost no change over all those years. Growth really matters. With a 7% growth rate, one can double your amount of wealth in 10 years, whereas with a 1% growth rate, it takes 70 years to double your amount of your growth rate. Now, my greatest example of tremendous changes are in New Zealand. New Zealand has gone up the chart in recent years with their dramatic economic reforms in 1984, and they are just behind Hong Kong and Singapore on the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And they managed to end their subsidies. They had the most heavily subsidized farmers of the world, and they ended their subsidies in 3 months. They had dramatically cut their spending. They closed 3/4 of their post offices in a single day. They privatized many of their industries that were controlled and owned by the government. All of these banking and railway and radio and film and tourist, airports, seaports, all of these things were owned by the government, and the government sold them off, which meant that they earned the revenue from that. They became productive and prosperous so that they weren't consuming taxpayers' subsidies, but now they were paying tax revenues into the government and becoming much, much more productive for society. They incentivized other government agencies by insisting that they had to make a profit, such as the Weather Bureau, that then cut way back on staff, but improved their services because they were selling their services to make a profit to radios, television, newspapers, farmers, shippers, fishermen, people who needed the weather reports from them, and they turned a profit. They cut their income taxes in half. They cut their regulations dramatically. They opened up trade by ending their trade barriers, and they ended currency controls. In all of these manners, New Zealand went from being one of the poorest countries in the industrial world to being one of the most prosperous countries of the industrial world. The same could be done in Greece, where there's so much debt and catastrophe in Greece over the years, and I would say that it should be. China has gone down in recent years, but it's still pretty low. The reason that China has succeeded as well as it has. You'll hear later from my wife that you can't really trust much of what is reported from China, but to the extent that it has created a tremendous amount of wealth and opportunity compared to what they had under Mao Zedong, is because they improved their economic freedom conditions, but not throughout China. They did so in certain provinces of China, which were the engines of economic growth, and other provinces of China are way off the bottom of the chart. And one of the greatest benefits to China was that they allowed a tremendous migration from the poorest regions to the more prosperous regions. And this accounted for a tremendous improvement in the prosperity, as people did in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was opened up to migration. And so the people moved from, were allowed to move from China into this, and it became a very prosperous city, just as Shenzhen did, moving from a fishing village into a very prosperous city comparable to Hong Kong. And that's by allowing hundreds of millions of people to move from areas of low productivity to areas of high productivity. So I would add a sixth category to the economic freedom of the World Index: openness to migration, where my own studies show that countries that are the most open to migration, the diligent, hardworking people from other countries, are the ones that will grow the most. And as my wife is a good example of that, a person who has moved from China to the United States and has become a very much greater contributor to society than she would have had she remained in the rural villages of China. So I'd say that openness and free markets is not only practical, bringing about great deal of prosperity, but it is humanitarian. It gives the greatest of benefits to the poorest of the poor in societies and lifting their lives out of desperate poverty. And to me, it's all because it is the most ethical. It's treating people voluntarily rather than coercively from power structures. It is to treat others as we would want them to treat us if we were in their shoes. So that's concludes my opening remarks, and I welcome any kinds of comments or discussion about this from your audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Very much for the side section. I believe we have learned a bit from this. So please, if you have questions or contribution, feel free to use the chat box. I'm going to read out the questions, and Professor Ken is going to answer any of our questions. Once again, thank you very much, sir. That's a very great and insightful section on economic freedom and prosperity. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll call upon you if we have questions just anytime soon. Thank you very much, sir. All right, so moving forward, we would move now to the next section, where we'll be talking about how to think about entrepreneurship and growth. How to think about entrepreneurship and growth. For this section, we are going to be having another seasoned speaker that will come up and have the section in person of Pa Bailon. Who is Pai Bailon? Permit me to introduce Pai Bailon to every one of us. Pai Bailon, PhD, is a fellow of the Mises Institute and associate fellow of entrepreneurship and Record Johnston Professor of Free Enterprise in the School of Entrepreneurship in the Sphere School of Business at Hokaluma State University. He is also an associate fellow of the Ratio Institute in Stockholm. He has previously held position at Baylor University and the University of Missouri. His research aims to explain the market process of prosperity creation and economic development with a focus on organizations, institutions, entrepreneurship, and management. Dr. Bailon has published research in top journals in both entrepreneurship and management, as well as in both the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics and the Review of Austrian Economics. He is the author of 2 full-length books. One, The Sane, the Unsane, and the Unrealized, How Regulations Affect Our Everyday Lives and the Problem. And 2, The Problem of Production, A New Theory of the Firm. He has edits the Austrian economics book series at Addenda Publishing, and he edited a volume, Next Generation of Austrian Economics, Essays in Honor of Joseph T. Salerno. Funded 4 business startups, and he writes a monthly column for Entrepreneurship magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome with me for this section, Dr. Pai Ballon. You're welcome.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Per Byland. I'm an associate professor of entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University in the School of Entrepreneurship there. I'm going to lecture to you today about entrepreneurship and economic growth. And my point is really to discuss the link between entrepreneurship and growth and show you why entrepreneurship is relevant to economic growth, which is not necessarily the case when you study economics. Economics has different theories of why economic growth happens, and those theories tend to ignore the entrepreneur, which is very strange, I agree, but that is the case. So what I will do is go through where growth comes from, what economic growth is to begin with, and then talk about how it's generated and where it comes from, and how entrepreneurship helps an economy grow and what that actually means. I think that is an important lesson that most people in the West too do not quite understand. People know that entrepreneurship has something to do with economic growth, but we don't quite know why or how it works. So I'm going to cover that a little bit because that's my specialization, and show you a little bit about how entrepreneurship is not only a component of economic growth, but it's actually necessary for it. So let's start with talking about what economic growth is. What does it mean when the economy grows? Very often we talk about this in terms of GDP, or gross domestic product, which politicians use to show how well their policies have fallen out. And we see countries like China targeting GDP in order to maximize this statistic and thereby show that the country is experiencing enormous growth. It's a statistic, which means it captures what you want it to capture. It means you can play with the number, you can change it. It's an attempted measure of economic growth, but it isn't economic growth. Economic growth is not GDP. GDP is just a crude measure. It's not very accurate either, but it gives us some indication of the economy's size. But what do we actually mean when we talk about the economy's size and the standard or the economic growth in a country or in the world? Well, we're talking really about the standard of living in society. So how wealthy is a nation overall? What type of conveniences and comforts do people have? What type of level of well-being do people enjoy in the country? That's the standard of living in society overall. And that's what economic growth is for. Economic growth increases this or raises or makes the standard of living higher. Another way of putting this, as economists would like to, is to say that an economy that has a high ability to produce the means that satisfy people's wants is wealthier or enjoys a higher standard of living than a society that has a lesser ability. What this means is that what matters in an economy is production. An economy can satisfy people's wants that might be simple but necessary wants, like hunger or having shelter somewhere to live. Or it could be other types of wants, like having fancy clothes or having the latest version of the iPhone or whatever it might be. Whatever it is that people want, if an economy can produce it and make it available to them, that satisfies those wants. It's not really a matter of the thing itself, it's a matter of the service that the thing provides to people, which of course means then that if an economy produces a lot of stuff that people value, a lot of stuff that people want to use, then that economy is richer than if it produces less. So production is very strongly connected to economic growth and the size of the economy, and therefore also the standard of living in society. Now let's look at at how we do this. How can an economy increase its ability to produce the means to satisfy people's wants? Well, there are two ways, really. And these are the only ways in which an economy grows, and how we can provide the means to better satisfy people's wants. One is to simply reallocate, redistribute the resources, make sure that they end up in better hands, that resources end up satisfying the more highly valued ones. And because it's probably not a super efficient or the best possible distribution right now. So if we can, if we can give, say, a carpenter a hammer and a baker more flour, then they would be better off, and we would all be better off, because it's much better than if the baker has a hammer and the carpenter has flour. So reallocating those resources is a one way of making society better, and making society have a higher standard of living, simply because we get more out of the resources that already exist. Another and more effective way, of course, is to create new resources and create new goods and produce new things that satisfy us in new ways. And that's what entrepreneurship does. And I'll go through both of these because it's important to understand how they work and what they mean. So the first one, to effectuate a better distribution of resources, happens through voluntary exchange. There are many different ways that we can redistribute or reallocate resources. For instance, the government can take from the rich and give to the poor, or they can take from, as they usually do, take from the poor and give to the rich. But that is a transaction that only one of the parties values. So that means you're making one party better off because you're making the other party worse off. And that's not quite what we're talking about in economic growth. Economic growth means that we have an increased ability to satisfy people's wants. It's not an increased ability if I take $10 from one person and gives the $10 to another person, because one person is $10 poorer and another person is $10 richer. That has not increased our wealth in any sense. It is only redistributed the resources. Voluntary exchange is different. Now, if we're trading and voluntarily exchange, that means that we want to do it, and that we expect ourselves to become better off from doing it. So we can only really understand this if we recognize that value is subjective. What I mean by that is that things are valued personally to us, and we satisfy our own wants on our own terms. That's how we get well-being. Our standard of living is a feeling, right? It's not a number. It's not a statistic. We can perhaps capture some of our well-being in statistics, but that's not really the core of it. The core of it is how well we feel about things, the comfort and conveniences that we enjoy, which are not necessarily the same for all people, even though we might share some of them. Now, because value is subjective, it means that I can exchange something that I have for something that you have. And if we both agree, that means that we are both better off. This is different from how we usually think of things. So when we go to the store, for instance, and we see price tags on different things. So say you go to the store to buy a 5-kilogram sack of rice, and the price is 10,000 naira. I have no clue how expensive or cheap that is, but let's say that's the price tag. Now, we tend to think about that 5-kilogram sack of rice as being worth 10,000 naira. That's not actually the case. That is the price. It's not its worth. Now, the reason we would buy it for 10,000 naira is that we consider the rice more valuable to us than the 10,000 naira. And vice versa, the seller of the rice considers the 10,000 naira more valuable to them than the rice that they give up. So if it's voluntary, if no one is forcing me, then it's just reallocation of resources. If nobody's forcing me or the party I trade with, but we voluntarily exchange with each other, then that means that we both expect to become better off, because I value what I get more highly than what I give up, and you value what you get more highly than what you give up. so we can both be better off. And this is the beauty of voluntary exchange, or beauty of trade, that when we trade and no one else is involved and no guns are involved, then both parties are better off. In other words, if we do exchange, we are better off, and we cause economic growth. It might not be a whole lot, but the more trade there is, the more opportunities for trade, the greater our well-being overall, because we tend to get better, more valued resources and better, more valued goods with every exchange. Now, as I said, every trade is an improvement. Now, in terms of productive resources, say we have cattle, or we have tools or machines or something like that, and we trade for them, and whoever is willing to pay more for one of those things obviously values it more and can probably use it to produce more value. This is how the market works, through an invisible hand, as Adam Smith had it, that whoever believes that they can use a resource to a very valuable end, they're willing to pay a higher price for that resource than someone else, which means whoever thinks that they can use a resource in the best way possible, or in the highest value way, will be able to buy it for the high, because they can pay the higher price. Which means if there is voluntary trade and there's open trade, and no one is meddling with it or manipulating it, then the resources are going to end up in the most capable hands. Those who are most productive using certain tools are going to be the ones who can afford buying those tools and then put them to work. And of course, since they're productive resources, you would put them to use in ways that would probably make you money, create a business, or what have you. But the same is also true for consumer goods. Consumer goods, when we trade those, they end up in the hands of those who are more eager to satisfy whatever wants can be satisfied with those goods. So someone who is hungry would be willing to give much more for a sack of rice than someone who has just eaten and has food at home, for instance, which means that overall, whoever is more hungry would have an easier time getting that food, probably not getting something else, but they would still satisfy their most highly valued want. So these goods would still end up in the better hands and in the better places where they do more good. So in this sense, every trade, it doesn't really matter if it's machines or if it's food or what have you, they increase through every exchange, they increase the satisfaction overall, the value overall in society, but it does so without creating new resources or creating new goods. So trade is super important because trade distributes resources and goods between people to make sure that they end up where they do most good, where they are most valuable. But we still need to create those resources first, and that's where entrepreneurship comes in. So entrepreneurship is an attempt to create new economic value. Now, what the heck is that? Well, new economic value means simply that we figure out a way to satisfy consumers in ways that have not been done before. So it might be a new type of food, it might be a new type of machine, it might be a new type of entertainment, it might be a new way of travel, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. But an entrepreneur envisions a good or a service that will satisfy consumers in a way that those consumers have not been satisfied before. So it could be that it's a completely new type of good or gadget, a new type of service. It could be that it's a new type of service to people in that area, but the good itself has existed elsewhere before. It doesn't really matter. The entrepreneur still needs to focus on the future. So the entrepreneur imagines that this new good or service will satisfy consumers to such an extent that they're willing to pay for it, that they're willing to pay such a high price that it can cover the entrepreneur's cost of doing it. But because you cannot know, even if you produce today and sell tomorrow, it's not a lot of time, you still can't know how many people will be willing to buy your product tomorrow. So the entrepreneur always necessarily bears uncertainty because the costs are now in the present, and you don't get any revenue until the future. So you have to bear that risk. You risk losing everything that you have invested because you do not know yet whether you will be able to sell or not. And for this service, this creation of new economic value, the entrepreneur earns a profit. Why? Because they deliver much more value, much more satisfaction to consumers than they were able to get before. And because they do so, consumers are also willing, through trade, to pay them a price that covers their cost. And if they can charge a price high enough, which means consumers are willing to pay that price for this good, so that the entrepreneur can cover the cost and more, they can earn quite a bit of profit, at least in the present, and until someone else starts competing with them, and then profit tends to go down and even disappear. Now, the way I want to explain, or tend to explain, entrepreneurship is through this simple equation, or the simple formula. Now, cost is, and these are, of course, wrong. They should be the other way around. So cost is less than price, and price is less than value. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that value is really the consumer, the final customer, the person buying the product. It's the personal satisfaction, the subjective value, the satisfaction you get from using a good, from buying it, from having it, that sort of thing. Now, this value is necessarily higher than the price that they're willing to pay, or they wouldn't pay it. That's the basics of trade, right? So you would be willing to pay those 10,000 naira for the 5 kilogram sack of rice because you value the rice more highly than those 10,000 naira. So the price is necessarily lower for you as a customer, as a buyer, than the value that you place in the good itself. Now, for the entrepreneur, it's necessary to try to sell at a price that is higher than your cost, because if that is not the case, you're losing money. Now, the price, of course, what price can you charge? Well, you can't charge a price that is higher than the value. That's not possible, because then your customers will not want to buy the product. And the lower the price compared to the value, the easier it is going to be to sell the product, for the simple reason that it's a profit for the customer. So if you provide something that is of value up here to the customer, but they consider the price to be down here, then this difference is their profit. That's how much they gain from buying the product. But if they consider the value here and the price is only here, then this little bit is the value that they get in return. That's the profit that they get, which is not a whole lot. And of course, if they consider the value to be here and you charge a price up here, then why would they buy it? They wouldn't, because to them, the price is higher than the value. And that's not a good calculus. They would rather have their money than buy the good. So in that sense, the price is always limited by the value that the customer sees in the product. You can't overcharge. It's impossible to overcharge for a product in a free market. Now, the cost is this means that the only thing that the entrepreneur can really change is the cost. So the value is really completely in the customer's eyes. The price is limited by the value that the customer sees in the product. So you can tweak the price, but you can't overcharge, and it's really limited by the value the customers see in the product. But the cost, how you produce something, how much of it is you produce, what means you use, whether you use machines or whether you use labor, what materials you use, all of this stuff, those are choices by the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur can still choose the cost to produce the product that the customer then values, and that sets the limit for the price. So one way of seeing this is, of course, when you're starting a business, when you're running a business, the first thing you have is a cost. If you want to produce a certain product, of course, you have the cost first. You know the cost, because you need a location, a facility, perhaps you need to hire people, you need to pay their salaries, you need to buy inputs, you need to have suppliers, you need to have shelf space for the goods, whatever it is, all of those things. You assume those costs. That's the first thing that happens. When you have the product, you can put a price tag on it and hope that you've guessed the price right, and then sell it to customers. And customers only get value from it after they buy it. So that's how time progresses with these things. But value goes the other way. Like we just talked about, the value really happens only when the customer gets the product. Excuse me. When the customer gets the product and gets satisfaction from it. That's when the customer sort of confirms their expectation of value and confirms that they are actually better off than the price they paid. So value determines the price that they paid and whether they would do it again. And the price itself is a limit for the cost that the entrepreneur is willing to pay. So this is important to realize, because this is the uncertainty that the entrepreneur bears, because they have to produce it in one way, but value goes the other way. What value is impossible to know until you have already completed the process and have the good and have sold it, or have failed to sell it. That's when value is realized. Before then, you have no idea if you're going to lose the money you invested, or if you're going to make a profit, or whatever else might be the case. That's the role of the entrepreneur. Now, economic growth then, for these two, voluntary trade and entrepreneurship as new economic value creation, for these to be possible, two things are required. First, private property. So we need personal ownership of things and land and things like that, because you cannot trade with other people unless you own what you're trading. You cannot sell to someone what you don't own, because then it's not yours. And you cannot buy from someone what they don't own, because it's not theirs to sell. And you can't gain ownership of something unless they have ownership and they transfer it to you. So private property is necessary for trade. Private property is also necessary for entrepreneurship, because what motivates entrepreneurship is the potential for profit. It's how you make money. And as we saw in the formula on the previous slide, what you need to do is figure out how to produce so much value that the price that you charge is so much higher than the cost that you earn a profit. That profit is yours. In a private property regime, in a private property society, the profit is yours personally, which is a great motivation for serving consumers in the best way possible, because the more value you provide them, the greater the profit for you. And vice versa, if you do it wrong, if you assume too high costs so that you cannot cover the cost with the price that you're charging and the price that you can't charge to customers, then you lose money, you lose the investment. That loss needs to be personal too. So it must be your personal property. It could be through loans too, but if it hurts you personally, that means that you will not take any chance and any risk. It means that you will go for profit that is a sure thing rather than profit that is a toss-up. You will go for higher profit rather than lower profits, even if and balanced with the risk for loss. But you need profit and loss to be personal through private property for this function to actually work, or it's going to be very ineffective and inefficient. You also need freedom. And the reason for freedom, and freedom here means simply that you're unrestricted and unhampered in your actions. So no one can tell you that, no, you can't do that. Or no one can tell you that you're not allowed to trade here. Or no one can tell you that, no, I'm going to take a cut from whatever you earn. Freedom means that the property is yours and you can do what you like with that property. Now, if you're not free and unrestricted and unhampered, that means that when you're trading, you're not going to be able to trade for the highest value possible, which means every trade it will benefit you still, but it will not benefit you as much as it could have, which means you are, relatively speaking, losing with every trade. Which this, of course, means that society is not going to be as well off, because if every trade is a little less worth than it otherwise would have been, then society is also in worse shape, not as well off as it could be. Now, the same thing, of course, and even greater is for entrepreneurship. If entrepreneurs can't try to produce new value where they think that customers and consumers will be most well off, then they will obviously try something that is not as valuable. They will produce things that customers will like, but not like as much, simply because they're not allowed to. So freedom is necessary to get as much as possible out of both trade and entrepreneurship and production. And here we have then economic growth which is the result of trade that distributes resources and goods toward their better uses, their more highly valued uses, and entrepreneurship that creates new goods and resources that will make us better off, and continuously better off. But these two necessarily must have private property, because that's the basis for trade and the basis for pursuing entrepreneurship. And we need freedom. Without property and freedom, there is no such thing as a functioning market, and there's no such thing as economic growth. So economic growth, just becoming better off, and the society working better, and the economy growing, becoming better at satisfying people's wants, that is a higher standard of living, greater well-being for all, requires private property and freedom. And those are individual rights, not collective and not societal rights. And they're not rights that are granted to you. They're rights that they can only be taken away from you. they are yours naturally as a natural right. And if this is the case, if there is freedom and there is private property, protected private property, then there is nothing really limiting or stopping a society from experiencing very high sustainable economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pa. That's a very great section. Thank you so much. Sorry, my network tripped. So that was a very great section, and I enlightened one from Professor Bailon. Thank you very much. Guys, if we have questions, see what is going to happen here. I'm going to share with us the Face of Liberty International email. So we are going to send in our questions to the mail, and we'll get a response in appropriate time. Okay, I can see a question from Victoria for Professor Ken, but he's not on the call again. So I'm going to be sharing the email with us so we can forward our questions in there, and we'll get our answer. Need to know about entrepreneurship and it can impact, society in terms of economic growth. Thank you very much. So before the speaker, we are going to take a short break, a 5 minutes, interlude, where we get to watch a documentary. So Leon, can you let me share the next 5 minutes I'll be to introduce the next speakers. Please don't go anywhere. You don't want to miss the next session. It's going to be a very interesting one, and I'm sure we don't want to miss out on that. Leon, if you are with me, kindly please let me share the screen for the documentary. So in the next 5 minutes, I'll introduce our next speaker.
Is based on the principle of self-ownership. You own your own life. To deny this is to imply that another person has a higher claim on your life than you do. No other person or group of persons own your life, nor do you own the life of others. You exist in time, past, present, future. This is manifest in life, liberty, and the product of your life and liberty. To lose your life is to lose your future. To lose your liberty is to lose your present. And to lose that product of your life and liberty is to lose that portion of your past that produced it. A product of you.
Professor Tan, from Professor Islands. I don't know if I get to share them on your social media. Okay.
Better off, or they wouldn't do it. Only they may rightfully make that decision for themselves. At times, some people use force or fraud to take from others without voluntary consent. The initiation of force or fraud. To take life is murder. To take liberty is slavery. And to take property is theft. It is the same whether these actions are done by one person acting alone, by the many acting against the few, or even by officials with fine hats. You have the right to protect your own life, liberty, and justly acquired property from the forceful aggression of others. And you may ask others to help defend you. But you do not have the right to initiate force against the life, liberty, and property of others. Thus, you have no right to designate some other person to initiate force against others on your behalf. You have the right to seek leaders for yourself, but you have no right to impose rulers onto others. No matter how officials are selected, they are only human beings, and they have no rights or claims that are higher than those of any other human beings, regardless of the imaginative labels for their behavior or the number of people encouraging them. Officials have no right to murder, enslave, or to steal. You cannot give them any rights that you do not have yourself. Since you own your life, you are responsible for your life. You do not rent your life from others who demand your obedience. Nor are you a slave to others who demand your sacrifice. You choose your own goals based on your own values. Success and failure are both the necessary incentives to learn and grow. Your actions on behalf of others or their actions on behalf of you is virtuous only when it is derived from voluntary, mutual consent. For virtue can exist only when there is free choice. This is the basis of a truly free society. It is not only the most practical and humanitarian foundation for human action, it is also the most ethical. Problems in the world that arise from the initiation of force by government have a solution. The solution is for the people of the earth to stop asking government officials to initiate force on their behalf. Evil does not arise only from evil people, but also from good people who tolerate the initiation of force as a means to their own ends. In this manner, good people have empowered evil people throughout history. Having confidence in a free society is to focus on the process of discovery in the marketplace of values, rather than to focus on some imposed vision or goal. Using government force to impose a vision on others is intellectual sloth and typically results in unintended, perverse consequences. Achieving a free society requires courage to think, to talk, and to act, especially when it is easier to do nothing.
All right. Welcome back, guys. So, we are back. I told you not to go anywhere. We'll be right back. So, about now, yes, Victoria says a great and inspiring documentary. Yep, I agree with you. Thank you very much for the night. So, moving forward, next section. And here we are going to talk about how the West became rich. How the West became rich. So yeah, again we have a seasoned speaker us through this section, and you all will join me in welcoming Dan Mitchell. So permit me to introduce Dan Mitchell to you all. He's the chairman of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, a pro-market public policy organization that he founded in 2000. His major research include tax reform, international tax competition, the economic burden of government spending, and other policy issues. Having also worked at the Heritage Foundation, Dan has also spoken to a wide variety of groups in 5 foreign countries. He also served on the editorial board of the Cayman Financial Review, and he holds a PhD in economics from George Mason University. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome with me, Dan Mitchell, as he takes us through the topic, how the West became rich. You're welcome. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do is share screen here and do a PowerPoint presentation. And I'm going to discuss why it is that some nations in the world became rich, starting with the countries that are considered the West, North America, Western Europe. And this is part of the big debate that exists between those who want smaller government and those who want bigger governments. I'm going to focus on fiscal policy, but some of what I say is going to echo the comments of Ken Schoolin, because he was talking about the Economic Freedom of the World Index and how there are various factors that determine whether countries become rich. And I also will be sharing the same thing he said about historically, the world had nothing but economic misery. That's the natural state of humankind. And what's fascinating is a couple of 100 years ago, that began to change. Let me show you a couple of charts. This is from the Our World in Data website. That's if you're a wonky person who likes numbers, it's a great website to visit. But this shows GDP per capita, economic output per capita, starting in the year one, all the way up through 2016. And you can see all the way up until 1700, 1800, everyone in the world was poor. But then there was this magical explosion of economic growth in selected countries, where all of a sudden, after centuries and centuries of poverty, there was suddenly widespread mass prosperity in these countries. And here's a closer look at the data. Instead of from the year one, this starts in the year 1820. And you can see what are the countries that became the richest over these last 200 years. You see Switzerland and the United States, very rich. You see the United Kingdom and South Korea, but then you see other countries that are considered emerging market or developing economies down toward the bottom. And so really the question I'm looking at is, why did any country become rich? And why was it just some countries that became rich? And Ken already mentioned that it's not a miracle, it's simply following the right recipe. And there are these 5 major categories. It's not just in the Fraser Institute's economic freedom of the world. If you look at the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, if you look at the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, there are lots of different measures out there, but they largely say the same thing. You want rule of law, you want modest fiscal burden of government, you want modest regulatory burdens from government, you want as much open trade as possible, and you want sound money. If countries can manage to do those things, that is the recipe that will enable them to move from poverty to prosperity. Adam Smith, back in 1776, published The Wealth of Nations. This is one of my favorite, and he's, by the way, considered the father of economics. This is one of my favorite quotes because I think it says a lot about the topic that we're discussing today. He wrote, "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things." In other words, what he's saying, if government does its job correctly, peace, easy taxes, and tolerable administration of justice, then prosperity will naturally occur. But the reason we didn't have prosperity for centuries and centuries is because that's not what governments did. Governments ransacked their people, they exploited their people, they engaged in wars, they confiscated crops, which of course back then was the way they taxed people. And of course, there was no rule of law or tolerable administration of justice. I'm going to focus on fiscal policy, of course, in this presentation, but I want to say something about this rule of law, administration of justice issue. One of the key factors that enabled the Western world to become rich, and one of the factors that is holding back countries in Africa, is whether or not you have what Adam Smith called tolerable administration of justice. I think the reason the West was able to become rich is that the arbitrary rule by dictators, and whether they were chieftains or kings or whatever they were called, but basically the world used to be run by dictators, and the whim of the dictator determined everything. And when that was gradually replaced by the rule of law, checks and balances on the power of individual rulers, what did we get? We got all sorts of good things: less cronyism, fewer monopolies, better protection of property rights, neutral enforcement of contracts by a legal system, lower risk of expropriations, and of course, respect for bourgeois entrepreneurship. Per Byland just talked about entrepreneurship, and it's very important. Deirdre McCloskey, the great economic historian, has written about the Great Enrichment. That's another term for what I'm discussing that happened in Western Europe and North America. That was an attitudinal shift, that suddenly entrepreneurs weren't viewed as grubby tradesmen, they were viewed as creators, and it became a respectable thing to do. So all these very necessary core conditions for prosperity began to develop in certain Western European countries in the 1700s into the 1800s, and that, I think, was key in allowing economic growth to suddenly come about where it had been absent for centuries and centuries. But as I said, I want to focus on fiscal policy. And if there's one slide in my presentation that I want everyone to remember, it's this one. Because the lesson from this chart is that the Western world became rich when the fiscal burden of government was very modest, when government spending only consumed about 10% of GDP, when there were no welfare states, no redistribution programs, when there were little or no income taxes on people or businesses, and not just no income taxes, there were no value-added taxes. I mean, basically governments back in the 1800s in North America and Western Europe, they relied on a handful of excise taxes and trade taxes. But government, in terms of fiscal policy, was just a very, very tiny burden on the economy. And I want to show you some charts. This is from Vito Tanzi, is the former fiscal director at the IMF. And along with Ludger Schucknecht, who I think is now with the European Central Bank, they put together this chart showing what was the burden of government spending in 1870, 1913, and then after World War I in 1920, 1937, and 1960. And you can see before World War I, the burden of government spending in these major economies was only about 10 to 12% of GDP. Now, to put this in context, the countries in the world today that are considered small government countries, Hong Kong and Singapore, they have government sectors that consume 20% of GDP. So in the major countries of the Western world in the 1800s, government was only half the size of what it is in places like Hong Kong and Singapore today. And you can see, by the way, from this chart, even after World War I, all the way up until 1960, government only averaged maybe 20, 25, 30% of GDP, which is, of course, a lot smaller than it is in most countries today. And one of the lessons I'm trying to get across in this presentation is that the Western world became rich when government was very, very small. We went from agricultural poverty to middle-class prosperity in the 1800s and early 1900s, when government played only a tiny role in the economy in terms of fiscal policy. Now, we just looked at government spending as a share of GDP. Well, here is tax revenue as a share of GDP. And you can see back in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, tax revenues were only about 10% of GDP. And even as late as 1940, at the start of World War II, tax burdens were only about 15% of GDP. Again, these are smaller tax burdens than what you see in low tax economies today, like the Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, Singapore, places like that. So the lesson to be learned, and I underline this, I put exclamation points, everything I can to stress to people that if you want to copy the rich countries of the world, you have to copy the policies they had when they became rich. Don't copy the policies of the United States today. Don't copy the policies of Sweden today. Don't copy the policies of Germany today, because we have since adopted these expensive welfare states and costly income taxes. We became rich when we didn't have those policies. As a matter of fact, in many countries, there were no income taxes until into the 1900s. I mean, England had the first one in 1842. France didn't have one till 1911. Germany not till 1920. Belgium 1922. In the United States, we didn't get our income tax until that horrible day in 1913. So again, we became rich in the 1800s and early 1900s before welfare states, before income taxes, before government became a burden like it is today. Here's a chart that's also from Vito Tanzi. It shows by decade social transfers, in other words, welfare state type redistribution type spending in different countries as a share of economic output. And you can see all the way up till 1930, there was basically no welfare state. You had government redistribution spending in many countries, 0% of GDP. And even in the countries that had it, they look at Sweden in 1920, 1.14% of GDP. That's far less than what you have in Hong Kong today. So again, I'm trying to underscore the message that these countries that you see on this table here, they all became rich when they did not have redistribution, when they did not have welfare states, when people had the opportunity to go out and work, pay almost no taxes, but there was no ability to rely on government. So you had a very strong incentive to bring your labor to the market and try to become productive. Here's a different way of looking at that data. We're now, instead of Vito Tanzi, this is back to the Our World in Data website. And you can see prior to 1920, really prior to 1930, 1940, there was almost no social spending as a share of GDP. So if you go back to the 1800s, there was none. By 1920, there was a tiny amount, still a tiny amount in 1930. It's really in the post-World War II era, and really not until the mid-1960s that the modern welfare state really took off. Now, one thing to understand, I already explained that these countries in North America and Western Europe became rich before the welfare state, before the income tax, before all these policies. Now, they have since adopted these policies. They're not growing as fast. Now, the moral of the story, or the lesson to be learned, is that if you want high taxes in a welfare state, I think that's a mistake. But if you want those policies, make sure you first become a rich country. Make sure you have 150 or 200 years of being a very low tax, no welfare state economy. That will enable you to become rich. If you then want to not grow very fast after that, you can adopt the high taxes in the welfare state, because at least you became a rich country first. If you adopt the high taxes in the welfare state first, you'll never become a rich country. That is the key lesson to understand from world history. Now, by the way, there used to be massive poverty in the Western world. If you look at this chart, you will see that poverty, mass poverty, basically disappeared between 1820 and 1920 in the Western world, North America and Western Europe. Now, remember, the previous chart I showed you from Vito Tanzi, there was no welfare state. There was no redistribution spending. And yet we had this tremendous experiment with free markets and small government, and poverty, extreme poverty, basically disappeared in the Western world before the welfare state was ever enacted. So don't let anybody tell you, oh, to solve poverty, you need big government, because the data is very, very clear that that's not what happened in the countries of North America and Western Europe. Now, I've been focusing on North America and Western Europe. What about the rest of the world? What can we learn from looking at that data? Well, the good news is that over time, the rest of the world is sort of moving in the right direction, especially Asia, which is the red part of these charts here. Asia used to be very poor, as was Africa, and actually prior to 1800, the whole world was poor, of course. But what happened is between 1800 and 1975, all of a sudden you saw Europe and North America basically move to the right side of the chart, and then over the last several decades, much of the rest of the world is following. Now they're following, but they're not catching up. This chart shows that you have bloated public sectors, too much government in the various regions of the world that are still developing and still should try to catch up to the Western world. But remember what I just said, you don't catch up to the Western world by adopting high taxes and a big welfare state. And unfortunately, a lot of countries in the developing world have governments that are too big. Now, in part, it's not because they have huge European-style welfare states. Instead, it's because they have excessive bureaucracies, government workforces that are too big with salaries that are too high. But the point is you can see that government spending is averaging, probably 25, 30% of GDP across the developing world. Well, what do we remember from earlier in my presentation? The burden of government spending in North America and Western Europe when it became rich was only 10% of GDP. So I worry that the developing world, emerging market economies already have an excessive burden of government spending. And of course, they have income taxes and other things that North America and Western Europe did not have. So I think that's a big mistake. Now, I want to emphasize a point that I've already made. There are wealthy welfare states in the world. Western Europe, by world standards, is wealthy, and most of those countries have very costly, very extensive welfare states. But I want to remind you that these countries became rich before they adopted those policies. They then made a choice I disagree with. They made a choice after they became rich, let's adopt high taxes in a welfare state. Now they're growing maybe 1 or 2% a year instead of 3 to 4% a year, but at least they became rich first. In Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, you have to make sure you adopt these things in the right order. You have to have the long period of free markets and limited government first. And then, of course, I hope you never choose to have the welfare state. But again, I want to remind you, if you adopt the welfare state and high taxes first, you will never, ever have a chance to become a rich country. Now, I want to begin to wrap up by talking about some of the bad advice that we get from international bureaucracies like the IMF, the OECD, and the United Nations. They are very, very destructive in that they constantly are urging countries to raise taxes and increase the burden of government spending. And you can see on the right side of the screen, they have all these interesting and clever euphemisms for giving government more control of the economy, letting government consume more of the private sector's output, resource mobilizations, stable resources, financing for development, strengthened fiscal frameworks. All those things are just different ways of saying impose higher taxes to finance bigger government. But as I say on the left side of the screen at the bottom, they never provide any evidence for how that's supposed to work. How do you make government bigger to help your economy grow faster? How do you impose higher taxes, thereby punishing people who work, save, and invest? How does that encourage more economic output? These bureaucracies, and by the way, the most amazing and hypocritical thing about these bureaucracies, the people who work there get tax-free salaries, but they basically go around the world and tell everyone else to raise their taxes to finance a bigger burden of government spending. Here's my depiction. Here's my illustration of their ideology at the IMF, OECD, United Nations. Step one is give politicians more money. Step two is magic. And then step three, somehow you get economic prosperity. But of course, you never get step three if you follow that advice. The only countries today in the world that are rich, I guess maybe a few small oil sheikdoms could be considered rich, though of course all the money's in the ruling families. But the only real countries in the world that are rich today are countries that had a couple of 100 years of very small government, very free markets, and then, as I said, they made the mistake, many of them, of adopting expensive welfare states. Whenever I do debates with my left-wing friends at different conferences and panels and television programs, I always present them with this question. Identify a single example of their policies producing success. And for purposes of our conversation today, it's the second passage that matters. I want them to show me a poor nation that became a rich nation with big government, with statism. There's not a single example anywhere in the world of that happening. And yet, as I just pointed out, the IMF, the OECD, the United Nations are saying, oh, these countries need financing for development. They need more tax dollars so they can make government bigger. That is the most anti-empirical bit of nonsense that I've ever heard in my life. Now, I have a whole bunch of examples, but I'm not going to spend any time going through them. But I have all sorts of examples using decades of data comparing free market-oriented economies with more state-controlled economies. And in every single case, when you compare the free market-oriented economies, you can see when you look at 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years of data, the free market economies are always growing faster, dramatically faster. In other words, there is a recipe to become rich. Obviously, the United States and Western Europe followed that recipe in the 1800s and early 1900s. But on some of these charts, I'm showing examples like Singapore and Hong Kong of places that became rich last century. Or here's an example from Africa. Why does Botswana grow faster than other sub-Saharan African economies? Because in the Economic Freedom of the World Index, they're ranked highly. Here's an example comparing Hong Kong, Singapore, and the United States. And you can see that these Hong Kong and Singapore have caught up to the United States. In other words, you can converge to the rich countries of the world, but you have to follow the right policies of small government and low taxes. Here's Hong Kong moving up with Argentina moving down. Here's a comparison of Poland and Ukraine. Again, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to flash these on the screen really quickly. Anybody should feel free to message me if they want these slides. I'll be happy to share them either through the organizers or just contact me directly. Chile is an example of a country in Latin America that became very rich in a very short period of time. Taiwan is a great success story of a country that's became rich after World War II. South Korea and Singapore, of course. Here's Botswana versus all of Africa, another example. Chile versus the entire world, Taiwan and South Korea. Everyone says China's growth is very impressive, but it's not that impressive when you compare it to Taiwan. Taiwan is much more free market than China. So there's a very clear lesson that Chinese people can become very, very rich, just not in China, because China still has a state-controlled economy. But Chinese people in Taiwan, in Singapore, and Hong Kong, they become rich. Here's Hong Kong growing much faster than France and now being much richer than France. Here's West Germany versus East Germany. Here's Chile versus the rest of South America. And this shows how Western Europe is no longer catching up to the United States. Why? Because they have a big welfare state, and the United States, we have a medium-sized welfare state. But here's countries that have caught up to the United States, not just Hong Kong and Singapore, but Switzerland as well. Switzerland is probably the only example of a free market, small government economy still in Europe. Anyhow, here is my websites, and also at the bottom, my email address for anybody that wants this presentation. Hopefully I kept within my time, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions if I did leave some time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.
That was a very powerful speech. Okay, Damilola, are you back? Thank you.
Yes, my network tripped. I'm sorry about that. Thank you so very much, Dan. That was a very great section. Short but very insightful. Thank you so much. He did share his email with us. So just so you are interested in the slides or you would like to ask one or few questions, you can reach out via the Face of Liberty International email I shared earlier on, or you can reach Dan directly via the email that he shared on the screen. Okay. So also, if we have questions, you can direct your questions to Face of Liberty International email, or if you have a question particularly for Dan, you can direct it to his email directly. I'm very sure he's going to reply your questions. Thank you very much for this great and insightful section. Once again, Dan, it's a privilege to have you on this call. Thank you so very much. We really do appreciate it. Okay, so guys, let's take this moment to go to the chat box and appreciate our speakers. We already have 3 speakers that have enlightened us on 3 different topics. We've had Ken Scotland, we've had Pa Bailon, we have Dan Mitchell now, and I'm going to be inviting to this call very soon, Christopher Lingu. But before I do that, please let's take to the chat box to appreciate our speakers. They have really done good justice to the topic, and they have enlightened us greatly. Thank you very much. So now moving forward, I'm going to be calling up on the next speaker, who happens to be the last speaker for this call. But while we are at that, please do well to, okay, I can see, let me go to the chat box. I can see John. Thank you so much, Dan. That was a wonderful and insightful presentation. Victoria says, thank you, Dan. The section is really mind-blowing. Osani Michael says, thank you all our amazing speakers. We are really grateful. All right. Thank you so much for the kind words, guys. Thank you very much. So I'll move forward now by inviting Christopher Lingo. He's going to speak with us on unlimited markets versus unlimited democracy. This is one great section that I'm very sure none of us will want to miss. So let's sit back and enjoy while I call upon Christopher Lingo. So permit me to briefly introduce him to every one of us. Christopher earned a doctorate in economics from the University of Georgia in 1977, and he has been employed at universities in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and USA. He's a passionate supporter of human creativity and volunteer actions that has led to social harmony. To this end, he travels relentlessly to discuss the impact of institutions and public policy on human liberty and dignity. His research interests include political economy and international economy, with a focus on emerging market economics and public policy reform in Europe, East Asia, and Latin America, and Southern Africa. His work has appeared as chapters in books and international media and scholarly journals. His book on the political economic of Singapore's development was entitled Singapore Editorial Capitalism, Asian Values, Free Markets, Illusions, and Political Dependency in 1996. He is widely credited with anticipating the tumor in the East Asian economics that began in 1997. The rise and decline of the Asian century, false start on the road to the global millennium in May 1997. Welcome with me to this call, Christopher Lingo. You're welcome, sir. Over to you.
Hi, nice to be here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, fine. Okay, greetings from Ankara, Turkey. I'm here for a brief visit, and I'm excited to be part of this Freedom Caravan. I haven't been back in Africa since the early 1990s. So even though I'm not there physically, it's nice to be back virtually. I spent time as a professor in South Africa, in Durban, and I visited some number of other sub-Saharan and Middle East, North African countries. So what I'm actually talking about today is how we're going to find the best way to live together. And living together as a human community requires that we live in a peaceful and cooperative manner if we want to have prosperity. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that unlimited government, or in particular, unlimited use of democracy as a way of determining life outcomes, is a dangerous proposition. And that by contrast, having unlimited markets, that is, arrangements where people are allowed to coordinate and cooperate in order to further their own interests, will lead to a much more peaceful and stable set of arrangements. So let's start with a quote from Hayek. Social orders are not, in his mind, deliberately created, but they come from a natural selection of institution, values, practices that lead to a traditional framework that develops over time, so that each individual human being can operate securely. That is, secure in the sense that others will not invade their property or use force against them. So this is what our general focus will be. Now, I'm going to, the general idea here is to try to find out how human communities of individuals, find a social orders, that is a set of conditions that within which they live. Now, I'm going to, as an economist, I'm going to start with scarcity, because as I will show you in my discussion, is that because of this idea of scarcity, there will be a conflict over resource uses that must be resolved. And what we find is that the social order is one of the ways within which we resolve these conflicts. So the social order leads to a certain set of rules that govern human actions, especially those that involve interacting with others. And I'll end with this idea of the importance of private property rights as a foundation for human liberty and prosperity. So let's start with this idea of human action. Now, scarcity is this condition that every trying to move this banner, there we go. Scarcity is this condition that every human being faces that involves that we must make decisions about how we accomplish things. Now, humans live in this world of scarcity. We have unlimited wants. We, as a matter of human nature, we economize. That is, we try to get the most out of what we have. We evaluate our goals and rank them in an order. And we tend to want things sooner. That is, delaying consumption usually requires some sort of compensation. And our value systems tend to be subjective. They differ from person to person, from generation to generation, from country to country. And life occurs within a radical uncertainty. We just cannot predict the future. Now, scarcity then is this fundamental and inescapable aspect of human life. So we have limited resources, we have limited goods, or individually we have limited abilities to do what we want to do. But there will always be conflict. I want to go out for a coffee at this moment, but I made a commitment to be here to make this presentation. So there's conflict over what I want to do with my life. I have to find a way to resolve that. The resources or use of resources are in conflict. I want to produce an automobile, but if I want to produce an electric automobile, I will be competing with other people that will want to use the same resources to produce the batteries and so on. So this is what scarcity is. It really defines humanity. So because of scarcity, we have to find a way to resolve these conflicts. And as I will show you in a moment, there are several basic approaches that we can engage in order to have this social order. Now, for example, we're always going to be trying to economize to use the most valuable resource, valuable output using the least costly inputs. And this conflict that I mentioned over the use of scarce things means that we want to have a moral and just way of resolving these conflicts. So morality and justice are key elements in here. And if we want to have a permanent and stable social order in very many different circumstances, we have to have these just outcomes. Now, one of the key conclusions, and I will support this in a moment. So I'm in a way giving you a conclusion before I give you the underlying argument. is that private property rights are essential. They're necessary for human liberty and justice. Any discussion about justice, in my mind, has to include discussions about secure and well-protected private property rights. Otherwise, if we ignore private property rights, we will almost inevitably violate this concept of justice. So the concept of the social order, we all know if we look around us that the social world is incredibly complex, but it's also orderly. That is, when we wake up in the morning, there are literally thousands of people living around us. But when we go out of our house or our apartment, we will find that most people are operating in an orderly manner. They drive on the same side of the road. They, in most instances, people don't use aggression against you. So there's a certain degree of predictability about what other people are going to be doing. So what we need to know is, why is there this orderliness that generally defines the communities within which we live? Now, of course, some communities are somewhat more chaotic and more unpredictable, but that is generally because they have a breakdown in the, particularly with respect for private property. And when you don't respect private property, that means you're also not respecting the individual that own it. So what we're going to look at is, what sort of rule structures do we need to promote or to define a social order? Now, there's going to be two basic ideas here. The first one is there can be an imposed order. That is, the order can arise from the arbitrary decisions of some elite. It could be government officials, could be a king, could be some autocrat or populist. And these will generally rely upon the use of force. And the state or governments are an example of this, where order is imposed upon us. Now, on the other hand, social order could be spontaneous. And this idea of spontaneous order is that this sort of orderliness within which we live arises from an evolutionary outcome of the decisions of many individuals over very long periods of time that are interacting voluntarily. And examples of spontaneous orders are law, in particular the rule of law. If you have been exposed to the Christian notions of the 10 Commandments, in many ways, these are a set of rules that people sort of accept as a general sort of guide for interacting. Languages are a form of spontaneous order. No one woke up one morning and said, mankind or humankind would be better off if we have languages. Languages are something that evolved, that were facilitating human interactions. They are a spontaneous order. And markets are another example of that. Money is another example of spontaneous order. So no one woke up one morning and said, humanity will be better off with money. The institution of money evolved and emerged out of human interactions. Now, it turns out that spontaneous order involves complex aggregate structures of evolving rules. And these are constantly being reevaluated by the human actors that are involved. So in other words, these arrangements are something like a survival of the fittest. It's an evolutionary process where the best set of rules will be the ones that will survive over the longest period of time. And they will survive because they satisfy the interests or the requirements of those people who are interacting within that structure. And these tend to be bottom-up rules. That is, they're from the individual actors. The satisfaction with the rules is based upon how you are affected as an individual and whether or not you're willing to continue participating within this structure based upon whether or not it satisfies your requirements or your needs. And the spontaneous order does not rely on a single conscious decision maker. In fact, that would be an imposed order. Imposed order involve or perhaps a group of decision makers, a political elite very often. And one of the features of spontaneous order, because it's a bottom-up process, it's flexible. And the rules tend to be general. And they tend to be simple so they can be understood by everyone. So spontaneous orders tend to have these properties of flexibility, meaning they can change when the requirements of the human community demand it. They're general in the sense that they apply in a neutral manner to everyone equally. And they're simple enough for everyone to understand and for everyone to be able to interpret them and to follow them without transgressing against other people. Now, how do we get these to these social orders? Now, complex orders, the ones that, the sort of human relationships that we see are emergent. That is, attempts to design them centrally or to control them centrally will always lead to failure. And this is one of the complaints or criticisms against central planning under communism or authoritarian socialism. That is, the leaders of these centrally planned economies mistakenly believe that they can design and control these very complex interactions of human beings. The reason is that they will never acquire the knowledge that is available only to each individual actor, and that is only known to each individual actor as that knowledge is produced by them. It's not something that can be accumulated, assessed, and then evaluated and then implemented. Because attempts to do that, once you get to the point of implementation, the knowledge is very likely to have become unimportant or unnecessary for the decision-making process. So what we saw in the centrally planned economies was constant states of shortages. They were unable to fulfill the requirements of consumers. They were even unable to fulfill the requirements of their own plans because the complexity of the human interactions made it impossible for these things to be designed and controlled. So knowledge, useful knowledge, is local, meaning that it is certainly at the individual level is the most local level, but at the community level, it could be if you have a unanimous sort of consent at the community level, knowledge might be valuable. It tends to be situational, meaning that the knowledge applies in this situation, but not in that situation. And that when the situation changes, knowledge that you acquired in one set of arrangements may not be useful or valid in other sets of arrangements. It's contextual. And so that it depends on the context within which human beings are interacting. And it's constantly changing. knowledge that is valuable at this moment is no longer valuable once technology changes, once tastes and preferences changes, once the market conditions change. So now, again, because of the complexity, predictions are very difficult. In fact, they're almost impossible to make predictions that are valid for a very long period of time, mostly because knowledge is changing. You know, what you want in your life changes based upon a changing situation. You walk out of your office and you discover that it's raining. You didn't know that before. You weren't prepared. And so now you need an umbrella. And you need it at that moment. And you couldn't have predicted it. The storm came out of nowhere. I mean, these kind of arrangements, these kind of situations are unpredictable, and the knowledge that you have at a moment in time will become invalid or not as useful as time progresses. Now, there's a complexity in our social arrangements. Now, because of that, just think about your family as a society. Depending on how many members of your family and extended family, it's very complex to keep everyone happy, keep everyone agreeing on the same things, even within a family. Well, once you move to a neighborhood, it becomes infinitely more complicated if you go to a community. Now, what this means is that social scientists need to be very humble, because they may have very little to contribute in terms of giving advice about how we should organize human societies. We should study them perhaps and learn which ones of those human societies work better. But social scientists do not have the capacity to give instructions on how to form societies or which ones are better or worse in terms of creating them. Now, it also requires that the actors that are engaged in political governance be humble. So our politicians and our bureaucrats need to understand, first of all, they cannot know what we need, and they must wait for us to communicate to them, because they are our servants. Politicians and bureaucrats are supposed to be the servants of the citizens. They are the people who we give instructions to through perhaps a ballot box, or our willingness to pay taxes, or our willingness to remain resident in that country or in that jurisdiction. We can move away if we're dissatisfied with it, or we can vote against them. Now, complex orders work better if you have simple rules. That is, simple rules that give a general guidance to that apply in many different circumstances. And I'll try to explain that in just a moment. And so it turns out that simple rules arise from human complexity. Living our lives, we discover that if we have a very few rules that govern us, that we can live a more harmonious life where we can prosper. So there are three really basic rules. One is don't lie. Be honest, okay? Number two, do not use aggression or force against anyone unless unless people initiate force against you. And respect other people's property, okay? And their meaning, respect other people's freedom. Now, if we live by those three simple rules, we could live a more harmonious life. Now, so social orders, as I mentioned, are all about resolving conflicts over resource use. Now, one way to do that is that we could enslave people, or we could use violence against them to force them to do things, or we could steal. Now, that's not a very satisfying set of conditions. It violates those three simple rules that I mentioned before. Now, it turns out that this describes most political governance, whether it's imperialism, autocracy, or even democracy. Because what's happened in modern democracies, citizens are treated as though they were slaves to the state. You are compelled to do what the state authorities tell you. You must pay whatever tax rate they decide you should pay, even if you object to it. They can use violence against you if you resist. And to use a favorite expression of libertarians, taxation is theft. Most taxation that is, as we see it in modern democracies, taxation is used as taking from one person to give to another. In other words, we're privileging one person over another. The person who must give up is less valuable in the sense that they are an object, and the person who is receiving from the state through state dictate is the subject that is receiving a privilege. Now, an alternative to this way of resolving conflicts, we would use not slavery, but free interaction, that people can interact with whoever they wish. They don't need permission of anyone else to go to work for someone, or to quit, or to start their own business, or whatever. Instead of violence, peaceful interaction. That is, find a way to cooperate with individuals. And instead of theft, voluntary exchange. Now, it should seem that the second approach to resolving conflict is a much more suitable one if you want to live in a peaceful and stable community, if you want to have a stable social order. And this is more generally found where there are markets and private property. Where there are markets and private property, we can resolve these conflicts, because if we know who owns something, then we can negotiate with them to find a cooperative way to, through a bid and offer process, to find a way for things that we want to be transferred to us. So private property and the market order are what I consider a stable, moral, and just social order. Now, the market order provides a basis for prices. If we don't have markets, prices really have no meaning. If you had visited the Soviet Union or China when Marxism and central planning dominated, prices had very little meaning. They were determined by an autocratic or a planning committee based upon their interpretation of what people should want or people should have or should need. But they had nothing to do with real human desires. It was all about an arbitrary decision by the planning commission. Now, in a market system, prices are signals, and they are the basis for indicating a way that demand can be satisfied by inspiring creativity by people who are unknown to us. Most of us benefit from goods and services that are provided by people we've never met, never heard of, and will or perhaps never know anything about them. These entrepreneurs in particular that initiate some sort of productive process that provides people with something that they value more than what they give up to acquire it, is what really makes the market order work for human beings and individuals. Now, the interesting thing about private property is that it supports the liberty of even those who don't even own private property. Now, I, for example, own no apartment or house. I rent hotel rooms or apartments, but I'm benefited by other people owning private property because I have an opportunity to find a way to coordinate my needs with them through a pricing system, a bid and offer system, where I say, well, I will give you this much, I will offer you this much, and then you will provide a counterpoint, for example. And so the private property encourages and rewards social cooperation. So this, if we want to live in a harmonious social setting, a human community of harmony, then we need to have private property and a market system through which we can transfer the use or the ownership of this private property. And the private property could be something like a computer. It could be a hand phone. It could be, private property does not relate only to land as property. So social orders are stable only if they satisfy community values, that is, the shared values of morality and justice. So what are these values of morality and justice? Well, let's look at this. First of all, voluntary trade. What we found before markets were well developed in Europe, Europe was dominated primarily by autocratic monarchs, kings or emperors or czars. Now, so that most of the activity that occurred in these countries that were led by monarchs, whether it be China or other parts of Asia, Japan, or Europe, most of the activities were to satisfy the requirements of the monarchy or the state. Now, what we began to find is that as markets developed, the system of voluntary trade led to the emergence of certain virtues, certain moral habits that people found to be both productive and useful in terms of promoting the sort of harmonious interactions. Now, for example, these are all identified by Deirdre McCluskey in her trilogy, which addresses this idea. Her work in economic history was trying to answer why did Europe experience this massive economic growth in the beginning in the 18th and 19th century. And, you know, there are lots of people who said, well, it was the accumulation of capital, the industrial development, and so on. But she said, no, you know, other countries had that before. If we look in distant history, if we look at ancient China, the Chinese had lots of technological changes, but they didn't utilize them. They weren't applied in a market context. So when they developed paper or gunpowder in ancient China, these were curiosities that were used to promote the state for the interests of the emperor, not to serve the individual citizens. What Deirdre McCluskey suggested is that a change in attitudes occurred, whereby people began to understand that wealth through markets would emerge out of this cooperative behavior where everybody would gain through this voluntary trade. So this acceptance of the wealth creation process had to occur before we began to see the enrichment, what Deidre McCloskey calls the great enrichment, that affected first Western Europe, and then it spread to the rest of the world. Now, one simple statement that encapsulates the entire idea behind Deidre McCloskey's work was spoken by Deng Xiaoping when he was a paramount leader of China at the beginning of the reform process in China, the modernization. And his statement was, to be rich is glorious. And what he meant by that is that within a market context, people who become rich because they make our lives better off. And that is something glorious. That is something that is good, that we need not to envy the rich that become rich through voluntary cooperative trade. We shouldn't punish the rich who have become rich through voluntary trade. We should imitate them. We should applaud them because we are all better off because of them. So, for example, what we saw in this development of markets and the voluntary trade process is that it made people forward looking. So they were hopeful. They were optimistic that things could be better because things were becoming better. More products were being made. Life was becoming easier. There were labor-saving devices that help people have more leisure time. And entrepreneurship is part of this. Faith, that people became accepting of and understanding that loyalty and honesty is part of this, having faith in humanity, that you can trust people, that they will deliver what they promise. Love, that is, what we find in market exchanges is that it allows strangers to become friends through the market exchange process. So what we do when we go into a shop, or we go, like I'm in Ankara, I went into a hotel, I had friendly relationship. I really liked the people. They were kind to me because they wanted me to stay there, and I wanted a nice place to live. So justice. So justice is served by when there is a social balance and honesty, where people treat each other in a balanced and a neutral way. They didn't say, for example, here, the hotel didn't say, well, you're from America, you're not from Turkey, I'm going to treat you differently and charge you a different price. They said, no, we treat you in a neutral manner. You are a valuable customer to us, even though you're from another country. Courage is something that emerges where people learn to, especially entrepreneurs, they behave in a autonomous manner. They are daring. They are trying new techniques, perhaps, or new unknown products to see how people, and they have endurance. That is, they continue to try over and over again. One of the characteristics of the entrepreneurs that I've met is that some of them became very rich, then they had failures, then they became rich again, they had failures, and they went through many cycles but they had endurance, trying over and over again to succeed. Temperance is another virtue. Restraint or humility, where these are characteristics which work better within a market context. Prudence, so where we reward people for developing how to do things and having foresight. Now, so markets and private property support a moral and just set of moral and just outcomes as a basis of a stable social order. Now, this is a critical idea that we have to come to terms with. Now, whenever you engage in a voluntary exchange with another person, your understanding of that exchange is within your own moral framework. So you do not engage in a transfer if you believe that it's immoral. You make a judgment there. And you don't accept the transfer unless you think it's just, that is, it's fair. So market exchange is both moral and just. You would not do it if you did not find that the transfer satisfied your moral sense or your sense of justice. Now, governments cannot make such claims. When we talk about something more abstract like social justice is a near impossibility. The most ideas of social justice involve political interference or political manipulation or political control of some sort to generate an arbitrary sense of justice based upon the instincts or the moral framework of the leadership, the political leaders, or maybe a bureaucracy. But within markets, each individual is making moral decisions about whether or not this transfer satisfies their sense of morality and satisfies their sense of justice. So I'm going to make it a bit short and open it up to questions because I have an appointment that I have to keep in a short while. So if you have any other questions that are not addressed here, feel free to send me an email, but I'll take questions now. Thank you very much. Is anybody else?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. This is a really great section. Thank you so much for your time. If we do have any question, you can reach out via the Face of Liberty International email, or here on the screen we have Christopher email, so you might decide to reach out to him with your question. Thank you very much for this insightful section on the big government, democracy, and the search for a just social order. Thank you very much. Okay. So if you are still here, please take your time to comment in the chat box to thank Christopher Lingu for this great section. Yes, John says, thank you, Christopher. That's a very educative presentation. Okay. All right, so I want to appreciate every one of us on this call. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for staying on the call till the very last speaker. And to all our seasoned speakers that have made this conference a very great one, starting from the first section that was handled by Ken Scotland, down to the second question by Pa Bylund, to the third section by Dan Mitchell, and to this very last one by Christopher Lingu. Thank you all very much. It's a great privilege to have you all on this call. And we really do hope that when next we want to hear from you at Face of Liberty International, you will do it to honor our call. Thank you very much. Really do appreciate. In the chat box, Sanu Michael says,
okay, thank you. I'm leaving.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't get that. Okay. He has left. Thank you very much. All right. So in the chat box, Usani Michael says, thank you, our awesome speaker. It is deep and insightful. Thank you, Mr. Christopher. It was worth it. All right. Thank you very much for that kind comment. On the call, I can see so many leaders, so many people that are interested in learning more about expanding the freedom in Africa. And I really do want to say thank you for joining us. The conference is not over. Today is just day one of the conference, and we are going to continue tomorrow, the same time, 2 p.m. West African time. Let's make it a date. We have so many interesting packages for us tomorrow. Other seasoned speakers are also coming on the call tomorrow to come and share so many ideas on financial freedom, health freedom, global citizenship, poverty curve, and liberty around the world. Don't forget that the theme for this year's Free Market Conference is expanding freedom in Africa. If you're interested in expanding freedom in Africa, then you shouldn't just come alone tomorrow, but you should also invite someone tomorrow. Share the event's Zoom link, share with your friends, share with your colleagues. And tomorrow it's a Saturday, it's a weekend, so we should relax and join the call while we learn, while we share knowledge, and we contribute. So once again, thank you all. I'm going to give it to the founder of Face of Liberty International to say a few words before we call it a day. Leon, if you're on the call, can you please speak?
Thank you very much, Damilola. It's been a wonderful session. Thank you very much for everyone who is here today. Thank you, Mr. Dan, John, Kyle, Rogers, I can see you. John and Kyle will be speaking tomorrow. Yeah. Oh, you've gone off the tie. All right. John will be speaking tomorrow. Kyle will be speaking tomorrow. We'll be having Mark Victor from the Live and Let Live movement speak tomorrow. We'll be having Liz Coolan speak tomorrow about what the China model is and what we need to do about it, either to take it in or to shun it completely. We have a lot of speakers coming up tomorrow, as Damilola has mentioned, and tomorrow being a Saturday, we believe we'll have more people to come in and join us, because there won't really be work for most of us, so to speak. So thanks for staying till the end. I'll see you tomorrow by 2 p.m. I would so much love if every one of us can put on a video so that we can take a quick snapshot, if that is possible. Wouldn't mind that. If every one of us can put on their videos so that we can get a quick snapshot. Lambert, Akoni, John, Roland, Kyle, can we have our videos to take a snapshot, please? If we can get it in person, I think we should be able to get it virtual, if it's possible. Okay, I think it's already late in some part of Africa. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think it's late in some part of Africa. I just got some message. Okay. I have John Lisk. Are you able to turn on your camera where you are? We're done for today. We just want to take a snapshot to show people that we are here and all. Oh, nice! Good to see faces, man. This is nice. This looks good. This sounds good. All right. Okay. Smile. 1, 2, 3. All right. Thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow by 2. And like Damilola said, please share with your colleague. Share the Zoom link with them and let them connect tomorrow. 2 p.m. West African time, GMT +1. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Leon. Okay, so guys, we'll continue the same time tomorrow. Do not forget to share the event Zoom link with your friends. Do not come tomorrow alone. Come with someone and let us learn together. All right. See you guys tomorrow, same time. Bye.